All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You guys know how this works. You bring the interesting stuff, and we take a deep dive into it. Today, we're going to be looking at something pretty fascinating. How we understand the potential in young learners. This should be interesting.
Yeah, and I think this will be a good one for our listeners because they always want to make sure they're getting the most out of these deep dives. And I think this one on dynamic assessment will give some pretty big aha moments because we're really looking at how we assess children and thinking about some alternatives to those standard tests.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. I mean, we've all seen them, right? Those tests that give you, a score, maybe an IQ. But the research you've brought today really makes you question whether or not that score is really telling the whole story, especially when we're thinking about young children who are still developing so rapidly. So I guess our mission today is to really figure out like why these traditional tests, these static tests, might not be giving us the full picture, and how this new thing, dynamic assessment, offers a more insightful way to see what a child is actually capable of learning, especially those who might learn a little differently or come from diverse backgrounds.
Yeah, and the research is fascinating. Like when you really get into it, there's this fundamental critique of how we've traditionally done these tests, these conventional tests. And, the main goal has often been to kind of classify kids, give them a label. But the research really highlights how this label or this score might not be capturing, the reality of their learning ability, their potential, like that hidden intelligence that they have. And you could have two kids who get the same score, but they're completely different in terms of, their strengths, their needs. So the research is really pushing us to think beyond just that number.
I think this is where things get really interesting for me because, we're talking about the limitations of static tests, but, these limitations become even more obvious, even more problematic when we're thinking about children from, minority groups, those with learning disabilities, or kids from different cultures. Like the research from Rogoff and Chauvet back in 95 and Cole's work in 1990, I mean, they really shine a light on how language differences, just not being familiar with the format of the test itself, and even just those cultural assumptions that are built in can really impact a child's score. And it's not necessarily because they lack the ability to learn, right? It's just those other factors.
Sure.
Absolutely. And I think something else that static tests struggle with is that they often confuse speed with ability. We think about these time tests, and a child might actually have a really solid understanding, but it just takes them a little longer to process or come up with the answer. And then that time limit makes it seem like, oh, well, they must not know as much as someone who can answer really quickly. But it might just be that they're more thoughtful or they're more careful in their approach.
Right. Totally. It's like saying, if someone reads slowly, they must not be understanding the book, right? But the sources that you shared go even deeper than that. They're really arguing that these tests, these static tests, they're not telling us anything useful about how a child learns. We don't know anything about their specific cognitive functions, like maybe they're weaker in a certain area, or what kind of teaching methods actually work best for them. I mean, this is all really important stuff. We've got Feuerstein's work in 79, Guthke and Stein in 96, and Haywood's research. All these researchers really underscore how these tests just they fall short in giving us information about the learning process.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point because if we want to actually help a child learn and grow, we need to understand how they learn. And these static tests just don't give us that information. And on top of that, it's not just the cognitive side of things. These tests often completely miss the really important non-intellectual factors like how motivated a child is or how anxious they get when they're taking a test, their self-confidence, and even whether they've had good learning opportunities in the past, which, has a huge impact on how they're going to perform in the present. So you've got all this research by Haywood and Switsky in '86 and even earlier work by Ziegler, all showing how these factors, these non-cognitive elements, can totally change how we see a child's intellectual capabilities.
So just to kind of recap here, we've got these tests that might not accurately show potential. They can be biased against certain groups of kids. They don't tell us anything about how a child actually learns. And they ignore all these crucial emotional and motivational factors. And all of this is happening, while there's all this pressure to make decisions about their education, right? Like the sources point out that, we're increasingly needing to make decisions about school programs for young children earlier and earlier, which, makes the problems with these static tests even bigger. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, right? If these tests are so limited, what's a better way? And I think that's where dynamic assessment really comes in. And the research defines this as a much more active process, a teaching process even, where the goal is to really assess a child's thinking, their perception, their learning abilities, and their problem-solving skills by actually trying to change their cognitive functioning during the assessment itself.
Whoa, okay. So it's not just about asking questions and seeing if they get the right answer. It's about working with them, guiding them, and seeing how they respond, how much they can improve. And it sounds like from these sources, there are some pretty big differences between dynamic assessment and those static tests. You know, the goals are different, the process is totally different, more interactive, the tools that they use are much more flexible, and the whole situation is more like a learning environment than a testing environment. And really importantly, how they look at the results is totally different. They're focusing on the child's ability to learn and adapt.
Exactly. And I think that what's really cool about dynamic assessment is this shift in focus. So instead of just looking at where they are right now, their current skill level, DA emphasizes this concept of modifiability. So how much can they learn? How much can they benefit from instruction? And the research suggests that this modifiability is actually a much more accurate predictor of how they'll do in the future, how well they'll respond to different interventions. It's about understanding their learning journey, not just taking a snapshot of where they are at this exact moment.
Right. It makes sense that understanding how they learn is more important than just seeing what they know right now. And it seems like the way that DA is actually done, it's more similar to how learning actually happens, in real life. It's not some isolated testing event. It's more like a back and forth between, a teacher and a learner or a parent and a child, which is how we learn most things, right?
Right. And all this is rooted in some really strong theoretical ideas. And these sources really dive deep into Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. And you might remember his big idea: to really get cognitive development, you got to think about the social, cultural, and historical background. Like all of that plays into how we learn.
Yeah, he was really saying that, learning doesn't just happen in isolation in someone's head. It's really shaped by our interactions with other people and the tools and kind of the cultural knowledge that we have.
Exactly. And a huge part of his theory is this idea of the zone of proximal development, or ZPD.
Hmm.
And you can think of this as kind of the space between what a child can do on their own, by themselves, and what they could achieve with a little help from, a parent or a teacher or someone who's more knowledgeable. And so what DA really tries to do is assess a child within that ZPD.
So it's not just about figuring out what they already know, but seeing what they're capable of with a little guidance, which is really interesting. And the sources also talk about, the role of social interaction within this zone. Like they mention things like intersubjectivity, which is, like that shared understanding that happens between, the person who's learning and the person who's guiding them. And they also talk about scaffolding, which is where, the guide adjusts the amount of support they're giving based on how well the learner is doing.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
Mm.
Think of a parent who's teaching their child to tie their shoes. At first, the parent might do most of it, provide a lot of help and support, that's scaffolding. But then as the child gets better at different parts, the parent gradually pulls back, reduces that support until the child can do it completely on their own. So you're seeing scaffolding within that ZPD.
Right. So it's all about meeting the child where they are and then gradually giving them more and more independence as they master those skills. And Vygotsky also talked about, these psychological tools, right? Things like, language, writing, or even ways of organizing information that can help us go from, those concrete hands-on experiences to more abstract and complex thinking. And his idea was that introducing these tools, using them in the learning process, can really change how someone learns, especially those who maybe haven't had as many educational opportunities.
And building on that, building on Vygotsky's work, you have Feuerstein
Yeah.
and his theory of mediated learning experience, or MLE. And this is really focusing on the role of the adult and how they can intentionally kind of step between a child and new information or new experiences and modify that information to make learning more effective.
Okay, so it's about, not just presenting information, but really thinking about how to shape it, how to tailor it for the child, which is so cool. And they give some great examples in the sources, like helping a child focus their attention on the important stuff, connecting new things to things that they already know and understand, you know, giving that new information personal meaning and helping them see beyond the specific task at hand to those general rules or principles, which is something we all do as adults, right? We
Yeah.
learn something and then we apply it in all these different situations.
Yeah, exactly. And the role in the mediator, it's not just passive. They're not just, throwing information at the child. They're actively trying to develop those important cognitive functions, like understanding time, space, and cause and effect relationships. And it even goes beyond cognitive skills to, influencing their motivation and how engaged they are. And the cool thing is that when a child experiences really effective MLE, these processes actually become internalized. They learn how to learn on their own. They develop self-mediation skills, and it can even change how their cognitive system operates, like at a fundamental level.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. And Forrestein actually came up with specific criteria for what makes a learning experience a true MLE. The sources mention intentionality and reciprocity, meaning the adult is really trying to engage the child and the child is responding. And then there's transcendence, which is about going beyond just the immediate task to teach more generalizable things. And then, of course, you've got meaning, which is making sure the child understands, why this matters, why what they're learning is important. And then there are feelings of competence. So it's about creating an environment where they can succeed and feel capable. And then finally, regulation of behavior, helping them control those impulsive actions and stay on task, which is, definitely something that comes with development and practice.
Right. And I think these criteria really highlight how important that mediator is in the process. They're actively shaping the learning experience. And Forrestein actually made a really important distinction between cultural difference and cultural deprivation, especially when we think about, all these different learners. And he argued that, individuals who come from different cultural backgrounds might perform differently on some of those standard tests, but with the right kind of mediated learning, they can overcome those differences, fairly quickly. On the other hand, those who have experienced what he called cultural deprivation, meaning they haven't had those consistent learning experiences, they haven't had that mediation, they might have a more difficult time learning and changing.
Yeah, that's a really important point to remember, especially when we're trying to assess kids fairly, from all these different backgrounds. So all of this theory is fascinating, but what about the research? What happens when we actually put these ideas of dynamic assessment into practice? Like, how does it work with young children?
Yeah, the research is really encouraging, and there's a good amount of it showing that DA is really beneficial. So let's start with, how it's been used with children from different socioeconomic backgrounds, because I think, that's one area where traditional tests, often underestimate kids from lower SES backgrounds. And so, Zuriel and Klein did this study back in the mid-'80s using the Children's Analogical Thinking Modifiability Test, the CATM, and they actually found that both disadvantaged and advantaged kindergartners, they showed pretty big gains from, before to after the teaching part of the assessment. And those gains were actually larger than, what they saw in special education or children with intellectual disabilities, although even those groups showed improvement when they adjusted the scoring to allow for partial credit.
That CATM sounds like a really cool tool. Like they use analogies with colored blocks and there are different levels of difficulty. And the teaching part really focuses on those strategies for finding the answers, understanding the rules, and being efficient. And they found that across all the groups, the scores on the CATM were actually higher than on the Raven's colored progressive matrices, which is, like a standard static test. So it really seems like those traditional tests are missing, a big part of the picture, that potential to learn and grow. It's like you're looking at a seed and you're just judging it based on its size, not on, its potential to become a huge tree.
Yeah, that's a really, really good analogy. And building on that, Lids and Thomas, they did a study in '87 with Head Start preschoolers who were mostly Black and Hispanic children. And they found, similar results. They saw significant improvements on this test called the Preschool Learning Assessment Device, or PLAD, when they used mediation.
That's really interesting. And Serial, back in '89, he was doing research with this test called the Children's Inferential Thinking Modifiability Test, or CITM. And he found something really interesting. He found that disadvantaged kindergartners and first graders actually showed even bigger improvements after the teaching phase than the more advantaged kids, especially when the tasks were more complex, which, makes you think that maybe those kids, they just needed that extra support to really show what they were capable of. And, the CITM, as I understand it, it uses more abstract reasoning, like figuring out rules from visual information. So it's not just, simple recall or recognition.
Exactly. And,
Yeah.
Juriel really argues that, how well a child does after they've been taught in that dynamic assessment setting is a much better indicator of their true ability than how they do at the beginning, before they've had that mediation. And, we see this again in his 95 research, where he used the Children's Seriational Thinking Modifiability Test, CSTM. And he found that those disadvantaged preschoolers, they really improved, with mediation on these seriation tasks, which are about, putting things in order based on size or, some other characteristic. And that actually narrowed the gap between them and the more advantaged kids. So across all these different tools, with different SES backgrounds, we're seeing that mediation really matters, and it can help close those performance gaps.
It's really amazing, to see how much of a difference it's just that extra support can make. So we've seen how DA works with, different SES groups, but what about kids with, mental handicaps, developmental delays, or specific learning difficulties? Like, does it work for them as well?
Yeah, and this is another area where DA has been shown to be really valuable. So, Reinhardt back in '89 did a study with developmentally delayed children, and he found that they showed really good improvement on the PLAD when they received mediation. And what was really interesting is that those improvements actually continued even when they followed up with them later. And, this was a little bit different from the earlier study by Surreal and Klein, which, highlights how, the type of mediation, the group of children, all of that can really impact how effective the intervention is.
Yeah, it makes sense that it wouldn't be, one size fits all. And Riesing's research in '97 with second graders who had, learning disabilities or were considered slow learners, they found that while they needed more hints and guidance on these inductive reasoning tasks, compared to their typically developing peers, the learning potential test that they used gave a much richer picture of their cognitive functioning, and it was a better predictor of how they did in school. And that's really important, right? Because those qualitative details about how a child learns, the support they need, you just don't get that from a single score.
Exactly. And I think that's a major strength of DA. It doesn't just give you a score, it tells you something about the child and how they learn. And there's this other really interesting study by Samuels and colleagues back in '92 where they worked with preschoolers who had a variety of handicaps. And they found that the kids' scores on the CATM after they had received teaching were actually a better predictor of whether they'd be in regular or special education classes 2 years later than their initial scores or any other standard measures they used. So it really shows that understanding, that learning potential after some intervention can actually be really helpful in predicting, their future educational path.
That's pretty amazing. I mean, to think that a measure of, how much a child can learn with help is a better predictor than just their abilities at the start. That's really powerful. And I know we've talked about, different groups of kids, different needs, but what about children with sensory differences, like deaf children? Has dynamic assessment been useful in those cases as well?
Oh, absolutely. And there's this study from '92 by Zuriel and Caspi. They worked with deaf kindergartners,
Yeah.
and they found that while the deaf children, they initially scored lower on the CATM compared to the hearing children, they actually showed much more improvement after that mediation. And they actually ended up at a similar level to the hearing children in the post-teaching assessment. And, both groups actually had higher potential on the CATM than their scores on the traditional static test, which is really interesting. And they also found that, factors like, the family environment, the amount of cognitive stimulation that they had at home, that was a much stronger predictor of the deaf children's post-teaching scores. So that really highlights how important that environment is in supporting those kids.
Yeah, it sounds like DA is really good at uncovering, those underlying cognitive abilities that might be hidden by, those sensory or communication differences. And the research also looked at, children from different cultures as well, right?
Yeah, and there's a really cool study by Hessels in '97. He was working in the Netherlands with Moroccan and Turkish minority children, and he found that, the kids who scored high on the standard test, they also tended to score high on his learning potential test, what he called the learning potential test for minorities. But there were a lot of kids who scored low on the static tests, but then showed, average or above average potential on that learning potential test. And what's even cooler is that this learning potential test was a much better predictor of their actual academic progress, which which really tells you something, right?
Yeah, and Zuriel and Kaufman, they found something really similar in their 99 study with Ethiopian immigrant first graders in Israel. So they initially scored lower on both the CTM and the CITM, compared to the kids who were born in Israel, but
Mhm.
they showed much more improvement after the teaching phase. They basically closed that gap. And there was one particular subtest, the classification subtest, where they saw a huge improvement. And the researchers, they thought that this was more about this cultural differences and how they categorize things, not an actual lack of ability. So it really shows how what might seem like a deficit on a standard test could just be a difference in how they approach a task based on their background.
Exactly, and that's what DA can help us with. It can help us look beyond that initial performance and see, what a child is capable of when they're given the right support. And the sources also talk about, how speech language pathologists have been adapting these DA techniques to understand language development, to differentiate between, actual language disorders and just, differences in language use, and even to assess reading difficulties.
So it sounds like, DA isn't just some theoretical idea. It's actually being used and adapted in real world settings, by clinicians and educators. And it seems like it's helping them get a better handle on, how kids are learning. And the sources also mention, how DA is used to evaluate those cognitive education programs, the ones that are designed to teach kids how to learn, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really natural fit, because those programs, they're not just focused on, teaching specific content. They're trying to improve, those underlying cognitive processes. And so DA is a perfect way to measure how well they're working. So one example is a complex figure test. And so, the kids have to copy this complex drawing and then they have to draw it from memory both before and after. They get mediation on things like, planning, precision, those kinds of things. And that's a good example of what they call a far transfer measure, meaning, it's assessing whether they can take those skills they've learned and apply them to something new, to something different.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about, remembering the specific drawing. It's about using those strategies in a new situation, which is really important. And they mentioned this Bright Start program, which, it aims to improve, learning effectiveness by targeting those, cognitive, motivational, metacognitive skills, and they've actually evaluated it using DA. So Zuriel and his colleagues back in 99, they found that the kindergartners in Bright Start, they showed more gains on those cognitive development tests, the CATM and the complex figure test, compared to the kids in a basic skills program. But what was even cooler is that when they followed up with these kids in first grade, they found this kind of like sleeper effect where the Bright Start group was actually scoring higher on the CATM and on achievement tests in reading and math. So it seems like those foundational skills that they learned, they were having a lasting impact.
Yeah, there's another study by Zuriel and others in '98, and they looked at kindergartners who received specific units from the Bright Start program that focused on classification and seriation skills, and they found that those kids showed improvement not only on standard tests of visual memory and concept formation, but also on the DA measures, the CTM and the complex figure test. So again, we're seeing that transfer, learning in one area is benefiting them in other areas.
Yeah, it really seems like these programs are building those fundamental cognitive structures that help with all sorts of learning, which is really cool. And they also mentioned this structured program of visual motor integration, the SPVMI, which combines those MLE principles with visual motor practice, and that's also shown good results on the complex figure test.
And then there's the cognitive modifiability battery, the CMB, and that was developed by Zuriel, and it's specifically designed to be used for both, assessing and intervening in areas of, deficient cognitive function, like, seriation, pattern reproduction, understanding analogies, working with sequences and memory. And so one example is this sequence subtest, and that's where they use these colored blocks on plates. And it's really cool how they can target those really specific skills. And the research with the CMB has shown that it's really helpful in identifying and addressing learning difficulties.
Yeah, so it sounds like, all of this research is pointing in the same direction. That dynamic assessment is a much more valuable way to understand and support learning, especially for kids who maybe don't perform well in those traditional tests. And the sources also go into, comparing different ways to actually provide mediation within DA itself. Like, are there different approaches, different strategies?
Yeah, definitely. And, one example is a study from '89 by Miss Una and Samuels. And they found that when they provided, what they called tailored mediation, so really addressing those specific needs of, the kindergartners with learning disabilities on the CATM, it was more effective than just using, like a standard approach. And then Burns, back in 91, he compared, dynamic assessment based on MLE to just giving, graduated prompts and also to traditional testing. And he found that the MLE-based DA, that led to better cognitive performance and better transfer of learning in those preschoolers who are considered high risk.
And Keister, Pina, and Gillum, they did a study where they found that, using MLE and what they called hybrid interventions was more effective for helping, low SES preschoolers with, labeling skills than just using direct instruction. So it really highlights how important it is to teach those, transferable rules and principles rather than just rote memorization.
Totally. And the research also looks at, this idea of, are kids reflective? Are they impulsive? And how does that relate to DA? And so Zuriel and Schank, they did a study back in '94, and they found that, the second graders who tended to be more reflective, they did better on the CATM and the CITM initially, but the DA intervention, it actually helped everyone improve, and it especially helped the kids who were, initially fast but inaccurate on the CITM. And it even seemed to encourage, more of that reflective thinking in the group that received the intervention.
It's really cool how DA can actually, change those thinking habits, help kids become more strategic, more reflective. And Turiel, in his later work in '97 and 2000, he used the CMB and this other tool called the Syria Think instrument, and he kept exploring this link between, reflectivity and impulsivity. And he found that, the reflective students, they tended to do better on the tests initially, but the impulsive and fast but inaccurate groups, they showed even more improvement with the teaching. And he even found that, those measures of impulsivity and efficiency that he took after the teaching were actually better predictors of, math scores than the initial measures. So it really shows you that, a child's cognitive style, it really matters.
Right. And I think, as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into this research, it seems pretty clear that dynamic assessment, it gives us a much richer picture of a child's learning potential than those traditional static tests. By actually engaging with the learner, providing support, and focusing on their ability to improve, DA is it's more nuanced, it's more useful, it's giving us a better picture of what a child is capable of.
Totally agree. And for our listeners, who are interested in really understanding complex topics, this perspective is really valuable. It's a new way to think about intelligence and learning, right? It's moving away from that idea of, just a fixed score, and really highlights how much support and good instruction can really help a child reach their potential.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
really does. And it makes you think, how these ideas could be applied in different fields, especially if you're working in education or child development, or even just, with kids in general. It makes you really question, those times when a child's initial performance might not be showing us everything, what they could really do with the right guidance.
And that actually brings us to our final thought for you.
Mm.
Could a shift towards dynamic assessment, if everyone started using it more, could that fundamentally change how we understand and support learning in young children? Could it move us away from just labeling them and towards really nurturing and fostering each child's learning journey?
It's a big question, but, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about.
I think so, yeah. It's a really exciting area of research, and it has the potential to change how we think about learning and intelligence.
Absolutely. All right, that's going to do it for this deep dive. We'll see you guys next time.